What happens when a billionaire's cruelty toward a waitress's accent becomes the catalyst that exposes a family secret spanning 3 decades? When mockery transforms into shock as a young woman's linguistic abilities reveal a connection that no one saw coming. For Camille Dubois, a 23-year-old server at Le Jardin, Manhattan's most prestigious French restaurant, that moment came on a busy Saturday evening when real estate mogul Philippe Laurent mocked her French accent in front of his business associates. For Philippe, a man who'd spent 30 years hiding his own origins behind American success, it was the beginning of a reckoning that would shatter his carefully constructed identity. She was just trying to take his order, despite his deliberate attempts to embarrass her limited English. He was just another wealthy American who saw foreign accents as signs of inferiority. But when Camille switched to perfect Parisian French and addressed him by the name he'd abandoned decades ago, the entire restaurant went silent. Her fluency would expose not just his hidden past, but the daughter he'd abandoned and the family fortune he'd stolen to build his American empire. This isn't a story about linguistic prejudice. This is about stolen identities, abandoned children, and how sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty is simply speaking the truth in a language the cruel thought they'd left behind. The elegant dining room of Le Jardin sparkled under crystal chandeliers as Camille Dubois navigated between tables, carrying a tray of wine glasses with practiced grace. At 8 p.m. on a Saturday, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant was filled with the city's elite, all seeking authentic cuisine that justified the establishment's reputation as the finest French dining experience outside of Paris itself. Camille had worked at Le Jardin for 8 months, long enough to recognize the subtle hierarchies among the wealthy clientele. Some guests treated her with polite respect, others with benign indifference, and a few with the casual cruelty that came from viewing service workers as entertainment rather than people. Table 7 had been demanding from the moment they arrived. Philippe Laurent, a real estate developer whose Manhattan projects had made him one of New York's wealthiest men, had specifically requested a table in the main dining room where his business success would be on full display. His guests included Japanese investors, European financiers, and American venture capitalists, all potential partners in his latest luxury development project. At 53, Philippe commanded attention through his imposing presence and perfectly American demeanor. His English was flawless, his mannerisms completely assimilated, and his background story well rehearsed. Born in Boston, educated at Harvard, a self-made success who'd built his fortune through brilliant investments and strategic acquisitions. But Camille noticed something others missed. When Philippe spoke, there were subtle inflections, barely perceptible pauses, tiny linguistic choices that suggested English wasn't his first language. As someone who'd grown up bilingual in Lyon before moving to America 2 years earlier, she recognized the signs of careful language construction that came from thinking in one tongue while speaking in another. "Excuse me, miss," Philippe called out as Camille passed their table, his voice carrying the impatient tone of someone accustomed to immediate attention. "We've been waiting 20 minutes for someone to take our order." Camille approached with her professional smile, though she knew they'd been seated only 10 minutes earlier. "I apologize, sir. I will be right with you. Let me just deliver these wines to table 12. Now," Philippe said firmly. "My guests don't have time to wait for you to finish your other duties." The harshness in his tone made several nearby diners look over with curiosity. Camille felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but she set down her tray and pulled out her order pad. "Of course, sir. What can I get started for you this evening?" Philippe looked at his guests with a smirk that suggested they were about to witness something amusing. "Well, let's see if you can understand this. I'll have the coq au vin, but I Want the sauce on the side, not mixed in. The vegetables should be al dente, not overcooked like most American restaurants serve them. And the wine. Bring me something from Burgundy, but not too young, not too old. Something with character. Camille wrote down the order. Her English, careful but clear. Certainly, sir. The coq au vin with sauce separated, vegetables al dente, and a mature Burgundy wine with character. Did everyone understand that? Philippe asked his guests with exaggerated concern. I wasn't sure if she caught all the details with that accent. The comment was designed to humiliate, and it succeeded. Camille felt tears of shame prick at her eyes as Philippe's guests laughed uncomfortably. She'd worked hard to improve her English, but her French accent was still noticeable, especially when she was nervous or embarrassed. Perhaps, Philippe continued, we should order something simpler. I'm not sure our server here can handle complex requests in English. One of his guests, a Japanese businessman named Mr. Yamamoto, looked uncomfortable with Philippe's behavior. The young lady seems perfectly capable. Oh, I'm sure she's capable, Philippe interrupted. Capable of bringing us the wrong order, the wrong wine, the wrong everything. It's so hard to find good help these days, especially when they can barely speak the language. Camille's humiliation transformed into something harder and more dangerous. She'd experienced prejudice before, but there was something particularly cruel about Philippe's mockery, something personal that went beyond casual discrimination. I understand perfectly, sir, Camille said, her voice gaining strength. Perhaps the problem is not my English, but your expectations. Philippe's eyebrows rose at her directness. Excuse me? I said perhaps the problem is not my English, but your expectations, Camille repeated, this time with perfect clarity and confidence. Philippe's guests were now watching with obvious interest as the dynamic at the table shifted. The young waitress was no longer cowering under his insults. She was meeting his gaze with steady determination. Your English seems fine to me, said one of the European investors, a woman named Mrs. Schneider. Better than many native speakers, actually. Philippe waved dismissively. Native speakers don't sound like they learned English from watching cartoons. That was the moment Camille's careful control snapped. She'd endured his insults to her language skills, but his mockery had crossed into territory that felt deeply personal. Without thinking, she responded in the language that felt most natural when she was angry. Peut-être que vous devriez avoir honte de vous moquer de quelqu'un qui parle 3 langues, alors que vous avez clairement oublié d'où vous venez, Monsieur Beaumont. The effect was immediate and devastating. Camille had spoken in rapid, flawless Parisian French, her accent refined and aristocratic, her grammar impeccable. But more shocking than her linguistic ability was the name she'd used, Beaumont, not Laurent. Philippe went completely white, his confident demeanor cracking as if she'd slapped him. The name Beaumont was one he hadn't heard in 30 years. One he'd abandoned when he fled France, under circumstances he'd spent decades trying to forget. What did you say? He whispered, his own accent suddenly audible for the first time that evening. Camille realized what she'd done. She'd spoken without thinking, revealing not just her linguistic abilities, but knowledge that should have been impossible for a young waitress to possess. I apologize, she stammered, switching back to English. I sometimes speak French when I'm upset. But Philippe was no longer listening to her words. He was staring at her face with growing horror, seeing features that reminded him of someone he'd tried to forget, recognizing characteristics that suggested an impossible connection. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely audible. Who are your parents? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Camille felt her heart hammering as she realized that her moment of anger had revealed far more than she'd intended. My name is Camille Dubois, she said carefully. I work here at Le Jardin. Dubois is your mother's name, Philippe said, and it wasn't a question. What was your father's name? The other guests at the table were watching this exchange with confusion and fascination, clearly sensing they were witnessing something significant but unable to understand the undercurrents of the conversation. Camille looked around the dining room, aware that other diners were beginning to notice the tension at table 7. I don't know my father's name. My mother never told me." Philippe's hands were trembling now as pieces of a puzzle he'd been avoiding for 23 years began falling into place. "Your mother, is her name Isabelle Dubois?" Camille's shocked expression was answer enough, but she nodded anyway. "Yes, Isabelle Dubois from Lyon." Philippe closed his eyes, the weight of his past crashing down on him like a physical blow. 23. Years ago, he'd been Philippe Beaumont, a young man from Marseille who'd gotten involved with the wrong people, made the wrong choices, and fled to America to escape the consequences. He'd left behind many things in France: his name, his identity, his family, and Isabelle Dubois, who'd been pregnant with his child. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, lapsing into French himself. "You're my daughter." The words carried clearly through the quiet restaurant, and suddenly every conversation at nearby tables stopped. Philippe Laurent, one of New York's most successful real estate developers, had just acknowledged paternity of the French waitress he'd been humiliating moments earlier. Camille felt the world spinning around her. For 23 years, she'd wondered about her father's identity. Her mother had always claimed she didn't know who he was, that it had been a brief affair with someone whose name she'd forgotten. But Camille had suspected there was more to the story, especially when her mother would sometimes cry while looking at old photographs from her time in America. "You're lying," Camille said, though her voice lacked conviction. "My father is dead. My mother told me he died before I was born." Philippe's laugh was bitter and broken. "Your mother told you that because I abandoned her. I left America when I found out she was pregnant, went back to France, and then disappeared entirely. I changed my name, created a new identity, and convinced myself that my old life had never existed." The revelation was spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. Other diners were discreetly pointing and whispering. Several were taking photos with their phones, and the restaurant staff had gathered near the kitchen to witness the unfolding drama. Mr. Yamamoto leaned forward with obvious concern. "Philippe, perhaps this conversation should continue in private." "No," Philippe said firmly. "I've kept this private for 23 years. I've hidden who I am, where I came from, what I did. It's time for the truth." He looked directly at Camille, his eyes filled with regret and something that might have been hope. "I was Philippe Beaumont when I met your mother in 1999. I was working construction in New York, trying to save money to bring her to America. But I got involved with some dangerous people, made some very bad choices, and had to leave the country, and quickly." "What kind of bad choices?" Camille asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Philippe's expression grew darker. "I stole money, a lot of money, from people who would have killed me if they'd caught me. I used that money to start my real estate business when I came back to America under a new identity." The admission of theft hung in the air like poison. Philippe Laurent's empire, his reputation, his entire American success story was built on stolen money and abandoned responsibilities. "So you left my mother," Camille said, her voice gaining strength as anger replaced shock. "You left her pregnant and alone so you could start a new life with stolen money." "Yes," Philippe admitted, his voice breaking. "I was 25 years old, terrified, and convinced that I was protecting her by staying away. I thought if I disappeared completely, the people I'd stolen from would never connect her to me, protecting her." Camille's voice rose with fury. "You left her to raise your child alone in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Every conversation stopped as diners watched the confrontation between the billionaire and his abandoned daughter. "I know," Philippe said, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. I know how terrible it was. I've regretted it every day for 23 years. I tried to convince myself that you were better off without me, that Isabel would find someone better, that you'd never need to know the truth about your father. But you kept track of us, Camille realized. You knew we'd moved to America. You knew I was working here. Philippe nodded miserably. I hired private investigators to check on you both every few years. I knew when your mother married Jean-Claude, when you graduated from university, when you moved to New York. I've been watching over you from a distance, making sure you were safe, watching over us. Camille's laugh was harsh and bitter. You've been stalking us. You knew exactly who I was when you came in here tonight, and you chose to humiliate me anyway. The accusation hit Philippe like a physical blow. I didn't know how to approach you. I'd built this entire life based on being someone else. Acknowledging you would mean admitting everything I'd done, everything I'd stolen, everyone I'd hurt. So instead, you decided to torture your own daughter for entertainment, Camille said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. You mocked my accent, insulted my intelligence, treated me like garbage, all while knowing that I was your child. Philippe's guests were slowly standing and backing away from the table, clearly wanting no part of the family drama that was unfolding. But Camille wasn't finished. How much, she demanded. How much money did you steal to build your empire? Philippe hesitated, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper, $2.7 million. The number was staggering. Philippe Laurent's entire fortune, his Manhattan developments, his reputation as a self-made success, all of it built on nearly $3 million in stolen money. Who did you steal it from? Camille pressed. A construction company that was laundering money for organized crime, Philippe admitted. I was supposed to hide the cash in various accounts, but instead I took it and ran. So you're not just a thief, Camille said with cold clarity. You're a thief who stole from criminals, which makes you either very brave or very stupid. Very stupid, Philippe agreed. The stupidest thing I ever did. Well, the second stupidest. The stupidest was leaving your mother. The emotional weight of the confrontation was beginning to affect everyone in the restaurant. Several women were crying, and even some of the men looked moved by the raw honesty of Philippe's admissions. But Camille wasn't interested in his emotional redemption. 23 years of questions had finally been answered, and the answers were worse than anything she'd imagined. What do you want from me? She asked. Now that your secret is out, now that everyone knows Philippe Laurent is really Philippe Beaumont, the thief who abandoned his pregnant girlfriend, what do you want? Philippe looked around the restaurant, seeing his carefully constructed American dream crumbling in real time. By tomorrow, this confrontation would be all over social media and the business press. His investors would flee, his projects would collapse, and his reputation would be destroyed. But as he looked at his daughter, brilliant, strong, fierce in her anger, and magnificent in her defiance, he realized that losing his empire might be the best thing that had ever happened to him. I want to give you what should have been yours all along, he said, pulling out his phone and making a call that would change everything. Marcus, it's Philippe. I need you to prepare documents transferring 50% of Laurent properties to Camille Dubois. Yes, immediately. And call the FBI. I need to turn myself in for the theft of money from Costello Construction in 1999. The restaurant erupted in gasps and excited whispers as Philippe essentially confessed to federal crimes, while simultaneously giving away half his fortune to the daughter he'd abandoned. You don't need to do that, Camille said, though her voice had softened slightly. Yes, I do, Philippe replied. I've spent 23 years running from the truth. It's time to face the consequences of my choices and try to make amends for the damage I've caused. As FBI agents arrived to arrest Philippe Laurent for theft and fraud, he had one last conversation with the daughter he'd found and lost in the same evening. "Your mother," he said, as the handcuffs were applied. "Does she know you found me?" "I'll tell her tonight," Camille promised. "She never stopped loving you, you know, even after she married Jean-Claude. She kept your picture hidden in her jewelry box." Philippe closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of all the pain his choices had caused. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never stopped loving her either." As Philippe was led away, Camille stood in the middle of Le Jardin, surrounded by staring diners and wondering how her life had changed so completely in the space of one conversation. 6 months later, Camille stood in the boardroom of what was now Beaumont Dubois Properties, looking out at the Manhattan skyline her father had helped shape. Philippe was serving a reduced sentence thanks to his cooperation with federal authorities, and his construction company contacts had been rounded up in a major organized crime investigation. The business had survived the scandal, though it was now focused on affordable housing rather than luxury developments. Camille had discovered that she'd inherited her father's eye for real estate, along with his ability to speak to people from all walks of life, a skill he'd lost during his years of pretending to be someone else. "He asks about you every time I visit," said Marcus Rodriguez, the lawyer who'd helped Felipe confess his crimes and transfer his assets. "He's very proud of what you've done with the company." "He should be proud," Camille replied. "For the first time in 23 years, Beaumont Dubois Properties is building homes for working families instead of playgrounds for billionaires." Through the window, she could see the construction site where their latest project was taking shape. Affordable housing for immigrant families who reminded her of her mother arriving in America pregnant and alone. "Your French has improved," Marcus noted with a smile. Camille laughed. "My French was always perfect. I just learned to hide it when people made fun of my accent. Like, your father hid his identity." "Exactly like that," Camille agreed. "But we're done hiding. The Beaumont name is going to mean something honorable again." As she prepared to leave for her weekly visit to see Philippe in prison, Camille reflected on the evening that had changed everything. A cruel comment about her accent had revealed a family secret, exposed a criminal conspiracy, and ultimately led to justice being served and a daughter finding her father. Philippe's mockery of her French accent had been intended to humiliate and diminish her. Instead, it had become the key that unlocked the truth about both their identities, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is simply being authentically yourself, accent and all. The accent that revealed everything hadn't just exposed Felipe's hidden past. It had reclaimed Camille's heritage, restored her family's honor, and transformed a legacy of theft into a force for good. Her perfect French had done more than silence a room. It had given voice to decades of buried truth and proved that linguistic diversity isn't a weakness to be mocked, but a strength to be celebrated. Camille's story reminds us that the very thing others use to mock us can become our greatest power. A single accent, a single word spoken with truth, can shatter decades of lies, reclaim a stolen legacy, and transform shame into strength. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters, no matter how it sounds. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where cruelty is exposed, justice is restored, and the truth, spoken in any language, always finds its way